We're very happy to be doing this workshop today. How many of you came to the Niagara conference? Raise your hands. So a number of people. So you got to hear Dr. Bickman do a keynote talk on measuring progress in clinical practice. And we're really pleased that he and Dr. Douglas could come today and talk further about the Contextualized Feedback System, which is the project on which they've been working for some time. And I think you're going to find it a very interesting day. Len is research professor of psychology, psychiatry, and public policy at Vanderbilt, where he's been for a long time, and the director of the Center for Evaluation and Program Improvement. His research interests cover lots of different aspects of child and adolescent psychology, mental health services, outcome and mental health services, web-based outcomes measurement systems, organizational and psychological factors that influence professionals' practice behavior, and so forth. He's received numerous awards over the course of his career from the American Psychological Association, other associations, including the Education and Training in Psychology Award for Distinguished Contributions from the APA, and many other awards. Dr. Douglas is his associate at Vanderbilt and is also working on the Contextualized Feedback Systems. She's the deputy director of the Center for Evaluation and Program Improvement. She got her doctorate at Vanderbilt and was at Harvard and came back to Vanderbilt to work in the Center for Evaluation and Program Improvement. So I'm sure that you, like me, are looking forward to a fun-filled, learning-filled day, and we're happy to have both of them here. So please help me welcome them.
Thank you. So I'm just going to do a very brief introduction and then hand things right over to Len. As an overview for today, it's sort of, we'll see how it goes timing-wise, but we've broken it up into 4 chunks. Len will be talking about the real-world need and the scientific theory and the research evidence behind measurement feedback systems. CFS is an example of a measurement feedback system, or an MFS. And then we'll move into just talking about a big overview of what it means to integrate feedback into clinical practice. After that, we will turn our focus to some of the specific information that you can get through CFS and that we think is valuable to any type of child or youth psychotherapy. We've developed a battery of measures called the Peabody Treatment Progress Battery, or the PTPB. We'll be going through that because that will help set you up for a case study that we'll be going through. It's from a real case. We have gotten information from the clinician. We've been doing this for several years. And we'll be looking at some of the feedback and talking about how it affected the course of treatment for a 14-year-old girl. After that, we'll transition into a bigger picture again and talk about what it means to implement something like this successfully. Not only is this an evidence-based practice, but it's also a health information technology. So there are all kinds of issues with trying to put something like this into place in the real world. And then we will wrap up. Along the way, please ask questions. We will be trying to pay attention, but if we're not doing a good job at that, maybe you can start bouncing up and down or something. The learning objectives for today are very consistent with the way we've set things up. First, that you would be able to summarize the basic theoretical, research, and practice perspectives on the strengths and limitations of using feedback to inform practice. You'll observe demonstrations of us talking about and showing you how to use feedback in clinical encounters, thinking about it in session documentation, treatment planning, and supervision with youth and family case examples. Describe 5 strategies that we'll be talking about throughout for integrating feedback into clinical care to improve client outcomes. And then, to be able to understand how to utilize feedback in clinical care with youth and families. So I am going to turn it over to Len, and he will present an outline of the first section of our talk for today.
Great.
Here you go.
Thank you. I'm going to describe basically my section of the presentation this morning and give you a brief outline about that. Look surprised. Uh, they won't get it. Okay, so everybody has a personal journey, or should have one, about their own research. I'm going to describe, for this particular research that I've been involved in for the last decade or so, how I got there, why I think it's important, and my own personal perspective on it. Something that does not appear typically in journal articles, where you get a very dry introduction of abbreviated what the literature shows, but you never really understand, why did you do this research? Other than to get tenure and publish and grants and other things, and contribute knowledge, right? We want to do that too. Secondly, I'll give you a very brief introduction to what contextualized feedback systems is. We'll see, we'll get into plural issues later. But the issue of what does it do, why do we develop it, and why it is targeted or aimed at changing clinician behavior, which leads us to looking at theories of change. And there are several involved in doing this. Again, the picture to keep in mind is that we are trying to change the clinician's behavior here, not the client's behavior. So it's aimed at the clinician because we still believe, and I'm not quite sure how strongly I believe it, and we can discuss this, that we need a clinician. And I raise that because if you look at the research on what's called bibliotherapy, or reading books, some of the head-to-head comparisons, especially in parent training, show a lot of equivalence. So I think a lot of people can get better by reading self-help books. And so how many of you are clinicians or training to be clinicians? Well, having a choice between that and book publishing, I'm not sure which is a worse future, if in fact we don't need clinicians. Now, I think we still do. That might be the, in fact, active ingredient in what really makes things work or don't. But keep that in mind. I'm going to spend really 10 or 15 minutes discussing what I see are important problems. And I narrowed these down to 6 pressing problems. And it will be a little bit repetitive. I'll present the problem, then I'll present our solution to that problem. And this is for you to understand how we attack essentially the problem. So we start with a problem focus on what we need to do to provide better mental health services, more effective mental health services, and how we think contextualized feedback systems respond to that problem. Finally, or near finally, I'll talk about a study that was published last year, randomized clinical trial with CFS, and then I will discuss something that we just are in the midst of doing data analysis, a second study, and each one of these uses a different version of our system. That's a complicating factor for the real world, because if you're working in the area, especially of software, things change rapidly. And so we'll talk about version 1, version 2, we're on version 3, and we're actually about to produce version 4. Why this? I think self-punishment, because we think we continue to get feedback, which is the core of what we do. So we try to get feedback from people like yourselves about what we can do to improve it. And typically, improvement is relatively easy to do, except for us. It's been a major factor because each time we've changed it, we've had to change companies who do the programming for us. So we're about to move into a new phase with software that does much more basic things. Again, the problem being the software from 2 years ago that formed the basis of most things has changed already. And in fact, you end up in situations where they're no longer supporting the software you used to design your program. That happened to us while we were doing version 3, right? So, and then a little summary. Okay, so what is contextualized feedback systems? One of the things that we started with was the word contextualized. So there is this tension between one size fits all and fitting it to the environment. And there's this constant tension that goes on. We're not all the same. We all have different problems. We all have different work styles. You like to have something that's individualized. And that'll come out as a theme again about individualized medicine being a real major thrust in healthcare now. When I go back in time to systems of care, one of the core components of that was individualized care. And I'll talk briefly about it, but I was an evaluator back then, and I kept saying, what is it? What do we mean by individualized care? And how do we measure it? Never got an answer to that question. Couldn't figure it out, not in that context. But we consider contextualization to be important. Now, we are constantly, the other tension that will appear in our work is between being able to do something that's theoretical, conceptual, and value what we want, and doing it at scale. And that pressure, okay, is a very hard one to deal with. Because we're not, in a sense, laboratory researchers who just want to demonstrate a principle and say, see, it works. No, our sense is we want to take over the world. Well, not literally. But we'd like to have an intervention that you can scale up. And everybody's struggling with the scaling up problem. Well, the more individualized, the more contextualized the system is, the more difficult it is to scale. So you have, on the one hand, I don't have to ask, all of you use computers. You probably use something like, Microsoft Word. It comes out of a box shrink wrapped. Well, it used to. That shows you my age. It comes off you download it. And it's not contextualized. But it has so many features that you can contextualize that you can make the menu to be, the top bar to be whatever you want it to be pretty much, if you can figure out how to do it. And so there are ways that have developed with software to try to make it individualized, yet make it scalable. And that's one of our struggles, is trying to figure out how you do that. How much do you put in the hands of the clinician or the supervisor or the administrator that they can do without screwing things up, all right? And how much do we have to do? The less that we have to do, we as developers, we as sellers of the software, the less expensive it is for people to buy, but you increase your rate of making mistakes, and then they just get disgusted with it. So CFS, I define as a concurrent, systematic, monitoring, informative feedback, practice improvement tool. Boy, there's a lot of words. And we have this obsessive guy who keeps throwing this arrow at a target to indicate that what it's trying to do is show how good this guy is with his arrow practicing, and the big reason why he or she, no, it's a he, I guess, is good is because he gets feedback. If, in fact, we blindfolded someone, would they get any better? No. Now remember that sort of analogy and ask the question, are we blindfolding our clinicians? Are they getting accurate, systematic feedback on how their clients are doing and how they're doing? And that's the underlying issue that we're dealing with. So we're trying to say, you need something concurrent, which means, and this is critical, because don't take it for granted that concurrent is something everybody agrees on. So I'll give examples. The Australian government has a system in place for over a decade now that is designed to collect data from clients and provide feedback to the clinicians. If you were going to design that sort of system, how often would you collect the data? Okay, none of you collect any data. Okay, is that what I'm hearing or not hearing? Yeah.
Every session.
Every session. Why?
Because immediacy of feedback makes a big difference. We see that in addictions. When something gives you a response very quickly, it's much more addictive. And I think similarly, feedback that's rapid and quick is much more valuable.
Okay. So what did Australia do? They should have collected it every session. Did they do that? Anybody been to Australia? No. Anybody been a patient? No. Now, they do one of the nicknames for Australia is the clever country. I don't know if you knew that. They call themselves the clever country. They were so clever, they figured out that you were wrong. So they collect data every 3 months. Why do they collect data every 3 months? Yeah, go ahead, guess at it.
Well, I know from all the programs I've been involved with, it's usually 30, 60, 90, 12, so that's what's been done.
Does that make sense?
Not really.
Not really. But it makes administrative sense.
It does.
And that's why we do things. So they have 3-month reports that the feds wanted. So this is a 3-month report. So was it designed for clinicians? No. Yeah.
I would argue I'm wrong. It should be continuous, like family therapy training, where you have a piece in your ear, and the minute you can do something better, you get informed.
Remember, we're in the real world now. So we could put a piece in your ear, but no one's going to be talking to you because we can't afford to hire someone to monitor your practice full time. Yes, I would agree with you. Ultimately, there should be a little neon sign on the patient's head saying, good, 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 oh, terrible, terrible, something like that. I thought you were going to say something else, which is where we're moving actually, with our next version, basically, is collecting data continuously out of the session. So we see the world much differently, and the new version will be able to plug into lots of different social media. So we're learning that people put things on Facebook that relate to their mental state. Their activity level relates to mental state. So there's also other data out there that could be, with their permission, collected that can help you understand what's going on with your client outside the therapy session, where the real world really is. They did it every 3 months. Now, you have to understand the story behind this. The story behind it is there was a meeting the feds had, and it was attended by epidemiologists and clinicians, and it really was driven by the epidemiologists' desires to have some epidemiological data. They don't need session data. They 3 months is more than that. And they won the argument. And when I go back there, I keep saying, well, how much data has the epidemiologists collected? They didn't ask the epidemiologists, they asked the clinicians to collect the data. None. How many studies have been done, longitudinal studies have been done over the last 12 years with these data? Anybody want to guess? You were guessing? Nothing. Why?
They didn't get the data.
They didn't get the data. Clinicians were not getting any benefit from this. And in fact, the feedback was a data mark. They had to log on, ask questions, complicated, and to hire people in each community center to interpret the data for the clinicians. And they're still struggling, and basically, when I was there, I told them, this is never going to work for you, and so they gave me a visa to leave the country. But basically, it's a failed system. There was one place, I attended a workshop where this young woman got up, and she was a manager of a group, and she said, I get 100% of my data. People said, how do you do that? An amazement, because the typical thing is between 10 and 20%. And they can't even do longitudinal data, but so much is missing. She says, I told them if they don't do it, I'm going to fire them. And they were aghast. If you know Australia, you can't fire people in Australia. She said, and someone said, you can't fire them. And she says, they don't know that. So under certain conditions, you can get higher compliance rates. Okay, we know that now. It's a good little study of how do you do that. So their system, and there's an equally bad system in England. So these systems, and what happens is people say, oh, these measurement feedback systems, which is a name I came up with to describe it generically, oh, they don't work. And so whenever you hear something that doesn't work, ask what the it is. Because the it's could really be variable. So it doesn't work, doesn't mean much until you understand what are the characteristics of the it. So practice, concurrent, we want systematic, so we want some standardized data. I used to say clinicians don't get feedback. I was terribly wrong on that. They get lots of feedback, but all of it is inaccurate, or almost all of it. It's disorganized, it's not systematic, and it's heavily filtered by clinicians, like everybody else in the world. So we consider CFS to be a practice improvement strategy. If you want to improve practice, how do you go about doing it? First, we define it as part of treatment. This is not something extra. This is just as much as you say hello to your patient or client. You're going to collect data, and there can be individual variations, but we generally recommend you do it during a session. And this is an important legal issue as well, because the issue is data collection part of treatment? Can we build Medicaid for it? Okay, and the answer in the states we worked in is yes. So that this is part of treatment, and I think Susan will explain a little bit more how psychologically we consider it part of treatment, not just legally. It was designed by clinicians, in the sense Susan leads that team, and we spend a lot of time with clinicians in terms of collecting data about the form of the feedback. And one of the things she'll talk about, is our measurement instruments, but I don't want you to be misled by them. Our measurement instruments are, in fact, brilliant. But only, I'm being modest, what can I tell you? They're only brilliant because they're short. They're not any better than anybody else's. They're all the same. But we went for shortness. The shortest instrument possible will give you the best psychometric qualities under those limitations. What really counts is how the feedback is provided. Because people, clinicians, are very busy. They don't like data. They don't like numbers. We've done research on this. Other people have. So it's very graphical, and it's very, and we'll demonstrate this. It presents a lot of information in the briefest way possible, but allows you to not drill down, because we don't use a drill down, we use a blind that opens up to get more information if you want to. And it uses alerts. And we're still playing with how many alerts can a clinician stand. But we use an alert system to direct them to particular things, and lots of colors. And all these are critical elements and been tested by clinicians to help us figure out what. Supervision. How many of you are supervisors? How many of you are on the other end of the thing, getting supervised? What is supervision like?
Varies based on the project. But
That's a neutral answer if I've ever heard one. Is your supervisor here tonight? Yeah? Okay. We won't ask your name.
Smart graduates.
well,
And the
for
camera
project-
can't see you blushing, so it's okay.
No, in one project we're listening to audio tapes of ourselves, so that's been really useful
Or tips of yourself.
with the client.
With a okay. What are other experiences in supervision? As supervisors or no?
Well, early on, a lot of my supervision really turned out about being compliance. So it was helpful in some ways to the people working for me, but over the last year or so, I've really tried to move away from compliance and really make it about clinical feedback. But it's hard. I find that a difficult thing to do.
Why?
Because, well, I'm a director, and every day I have to look at compliances and different.
But why is it hard to
people I
give clinical feedback, other than time?
The one, it's after a session, I'm not there. We provide all our services in-home. So if I go to a session in-home, then I've got current, but I'm also depending on self-report from my clinicians.
Stop there. Okay. I said this from my talk. Name another profession where the supervisor only knows what the supervisee tells them. I'd never gotten an answer to that question. Now, if you want to think about how bizarre that is, if you really want to think about it. So it's all self-report of the clinician. Now, I've heard stories, since I'm not a clinician, that clinicians may not be telling the supervisor everything about what's going on there, let alone knowing it themselves. And I've had people tell me, well, here are the things I talk to my supervisor about because I know if I talk about these problems, they like it, and if I talk about those problems, they give me a hell. So we're very careful about what we say. That's if you have supervision. I was giving a talk in Norway, and I'm talking about supervision. I'm getting not your bright, interested faces that I'm getting now, paying attention, but a blank stare from them. And I say, I'm not telling a joke. I mean, I get that when you tell a joke in another country, you know. Doesn't. But a blank stare. What do you mean by supervision? So I described it as, oh, we only get supervision when we're being trained. After that, we're never supervised again. So there are vast differences in how. Some people get supervised once a month. Most of the time, supervision has to do with paperwork and administrative things. But if you look at most theories of psychotherapy, supervision is a critical element. We believe that therapists should be supervised and get feedback. I have my daughter's a case manager at substance abuse, residential substance abuse, and one of the things that she does is make calls to insurance companies about how many more days can they get for this client. And I always found it interesting to listen in and talk to her about it because neither one of them have any real data to compare. And so there's a discussion going on, sort of like you're in a cave and what's on the wall there. It could be very traditional. And can you persuade one person to say, oh, this person needs more days because of these things, but there are no data anywhere. And it always struck me as an interesting situation to be in. So there's not any data. CFS provides data for both supervisors and clinicians and anybody else to look at about the progress of a client and where they're having problems and where they're having success. Flexibility. One of the things that we discovered early on was that we developed a complex system because psychotherapy or treatment in most settings is complex. Patients don't show up. Things are scheduled differently. Some see clients every week, some see every 2 weeks. Different measures need to be used for different clients. You have age changes. You have language changes. You have a whole variety of things. Our problem with this was the more complexity you have in the system, the more expensive it is to build and maintain, the more difficulty it is to change versions, and so on. But we stuck with trying to have the complexity not be overwhelming, which is the other problem. In other words, you present someone with a very complicated picture, they're not going to learn it very easily. We were aware of this. So Susan will be talking about measures, and we developed a battery of measures as a sideline, basically, to developing this, because we didn't believe when we looked at this that there were measures that existed that we could use in practice. And so we created things that we think fit the workflow, and we'll describe a process that we do, which we thought you just can't punt this into an organization. As we point out, the organization is a change issue as well. How many more hours do I have? So I'm only on the second slide, I realize.
31 minutes?
Oh, I'll try. It just reminds me that the first time I ever taught, so I was a graduate student and I worked really hard the whole semester preparing for this summer course, which meant 2 hours every morning at 8 o'clock. You know, that's what you give graduate students to teach. And I had a stack of 3x5 cards like that of the whole course outline. And I went to the first class and I came home and I said to my wife, I can't go back. What do you mean? You know, we don't have an independent source of income. You just can't decide you're not going back. Why can't you go back? I said, I just can't go back tomorrow. Well, why? I said, you know that big stack of 3x5 cards at the whole semester? Yeah. I went through them all. Now I can walk in with 1 3x5 card not finished. So you learn something over time, and I'm not sure it's good, but anyhow, I'll try to move along. Administrative and reporting functions. How do we monitor the efficacy or effectiveness of our clinicians in the cases they treat? The answer, we don't. There's one of the things one of the other unique features of mental health services is the lack of accountability. There isn't any. If we operate at all, we operate on the basis of complaints on accountability. If we operate at all, the golden rule is don't have people complain, don't have anybody commit suicide, get your paperwork in on time, and you have a job. How do we expect improvement to occur under those circumstances? How do we expect good treatment to occur under those circumstances? It's a situation that's set up, essentially, for at best, mediocre outcomes. There's no incentive. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, too. Okay, so this is a picture of our current dashboard, and we'll be showing that more. But as I point out, it's a real-time, web-based. So CFS is called a application that's placed on the web, and it requires no computing facilities other than a connection to the web. Anything connect, whether it's a tablet or a computer or a laptop. We spent over 15 years developing it from different types of grants, and it does provide progress on processes. And what we think, this is a hypothesis, okay, we're testing it now, is that it enhances other evidence-based treatments. So it needs to be combined. One of the limitations that I'll talk about of evidence-based treatments that exist in this whole series is, do they have a good feedback system included in it? How do you know you're on track, both in terms of patients' or clients' progress, or in following the script about fidelity, which we think is critical. And so far, and this is a claim that we can make because there's no research in the area, so it's easy. Ours is the only system that shows actually improves outcomes for children and adolescents. Okay. Now, the personal part. Two issues really influenced me in terms of why develop CFS, why move to that. And one of them is an example from cancer treatment of children. And there's certain things that struck my eye about it. Mainly for leukemia, but for a lot of childhood cancers, and in a period of the last 20 or 30 years, cure rates changed radically. I mean, from 20 to 80%. Cures. How'd they do this? Some miracle drug? No. A series of miracle drugs, maybe. If you have the misfortune to have a child that has been diagnosed with cancer and treated in a hospital, where most children are, almost invariably they'll enter a randomized clinical trial. Think about that. Randomized clinical trial in mental health for us is things that researchers do, not real people. I don't want to imply researchers not real people, but you know what I mean. In childhood cancer, that's not the case. Every child who is treated, therefore, adds to knowledge about how to treat cancer better. Think about that. And every client should be an opportunity to learn. Makes sense, doesn't it? Seems like a waste not to learn something. But, and this applies to all human services, few, if any, learn from their treatment. It's not part of their mantra of who they are even. We're not a learning organization, we're a service organization. Like, these should be different. So every child treated is an opportunity to learn. Every child we don't learn from is a lost opportunity. And we can't afford to lose these opportunities. One of the ways that we need to learn, and probably in the future, given, now, here we are, universities oriented toward NIH grants, SAMHSA grants, whatever. Bill, how many do you think there are out there doing randomized clinical trials with children?
How many?
How many grants?
How many grants?
Yeah. That you don't have. I know you have the majority of them, but other than that.
That is not that many.
No.
NIH grants, maybe 100.
Maybe 100.
Yeah, not that many.
I don't think there's even that many. You have a sense? But it's not a lot. And they're focused, and so if you think about that as the only way to gain knowledge, it's a very limited approach. And lots of questions can't be answered from randomized clinical trials. I'm a person who does a lot of them all his life, but also realized if you're saying, I'm going to look at these variables, there's only, in the first study, I decided out of hubris that I wanted to do a factorial field experiment. People don't do factorial field experiments. And I know why, because they're smarter than they are braver. They're hard to do, very hard to pull off, to try to manipulate more than one variable at a time. And so most of the times we have just main effects, really, and then some interaction effects we can do statistically. But usually, so if you think about even 100 experiments doing one variable at a time, we're not going to acquire a lot of knowledge real quickly. How do we improve clinical effectiveness of systems of care? Everybody know what a system of care is? Anybody want to tell me? Oh, you know, but you're going to keep it from me, right? And the rest of us. What's a system of care? This is the state that birthed it. Don't know. See, that's the problem, okay? Those of you who may know the Fort Bragg study done in 1989, 1994, I know some of you probably were still in grade school or something back then. But this was the first and almost the last study done on testing systems of care. And this was a major study, as I said, major. We can't get that money nowadays. $94 million funded by the Army, and I had an NIH grant to study it as well, to try to answer the question, do systems of care, which is typically a range of services, all right, come on, guys, and it has this individualized, this service system was designed to provide unlimited resources to children and families. So if clinicians said, oh, the parent has car problems, we'll send a cab for the kid, that would happen. If they said, this kid needs treatment every day, that would happen. And this was back in the day when the only treatment that was available was outpatient or hospitalization. I know you probably can't imagine that, but there was no group homes, there was no group treatment, there was no intensive outpatient. Those things were unknown. And this was the first place they tested that. Let's bring in the full thing. We have one point of entry. We will have intensive diagnostic assessment for a couple of days with each family. We will then hire people to provide as much treatment as they need or want with unlimited resources. Okay? I won't go into details how they ended up that being the U.S. Army that did this, but it was basically, at that point, adolescent and child mental health services was the fastest growing expense for the Army. So it wasn't something that was totally off the wall, but this was all political in terms of how it happened. Long story short, after 5 years, what we found, we had comparison sites of other military posts that had similar children. And one of the nice things about doing even a quasi-experiment with the military is you don't have to ask about, well, are they, if I'm going to do San Diego and St. Louis, am I having equivalent populations? Probably not. But these guys wore the same clothes to work every day. Not the same clothes, but same uniform. They were in the same rotation schedule. So these were as similar as you could get in terms of environments and the type of people, regardless where they were. And we had 2 sites that served as comparison sites for traditional services. Lo and behold, we found that it was no better. Outcomes, which was the first time actually outcomes were measured, as well as cost. We measured cost of services and found out, you know, it wasn't cheaper, it was more expensive. Why was it more expensive? Because everybody had to think, look at all the hospitalizations we're avoiding, because that was part of the mantra. We could put a kid into a group home at $200 a day as opposed to $500 a day for hospital. And all these kids went to group homes that would have been in hospitals. What am I missing from that equation? I gave you the number of kids and I gave you the rate per day. Yeah.
Ensuring that the practices were evidence-based.
Nope. Nobody did evidence-based back then.
Duration.
Duration. Come on, a little algebra. So if you kept a kid in an outpatient facility for 10 times longer at half the price, you weren't saving any money. And that's one of the things that really, since they didn't have that perspective. And in fact, when I got called by saying, oh, I heard this reduces hospitalization, so we can start closing down some of our hospitals. I said, oh no, you got to build more. Because one of the goals, and they accomplished it, was to increase access. And their access went from 3% to 8%. It was going like this. And the Army was convinced in 5 more years, every kid will be treated for mental health problems. So it was more expensive and it was not any more effective. We replicated it in a randomized clinical trial in a second study in a place, Canton, Ohio, in Stark County. Killed that service because again, we found kids were either randomly assigned to either the system of care they had, which was rated the best in the country at that point, or parents were told, go find your services in the community. And this was ethical because we didn't have proof that, the proof was in fact there was no difference. And in fact, we found the kids who got no services did pretty much the same as kids who got services. So you start questioning what's going on here. I was exiled to Australia for several years back then, so I know Australia because everybody expected this would be the crowning glory of finding systems of care really do deliver. They didn't. What they mistakenly made is they rearranged the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. It doesn't matter how you do that, the ship will sink. And the key that's recognized by SAMHSA now, after spending, anybody involved in a system of care grant? Okay. It lasted for 12 years and they spent $1 billion of federal funds. This was line item in the federal budget. Never able to show that it delivered effective services. So we've experimented, but our data didn't, but now they say intervention, services, and supports, and that's the level that we're at. We're at the treatment level, not the system level. System level things are important for system level variables. And by that I mean access and cost, but not clinical outcomes. Clinical outcomes, you want to affect them, affect it at the treatment level. And now they are putting much more emphasis on accountability and outcomes. I've yet to see it come to fruition, but the culture have changed. People are talking less and less about the systems of care. Those who don't read the literature, who don't understand the history, are bound to repeat the same thing because it makes a lot of sense to provide a system of care. I'm not saying they're bad. It's insufficient, though. Okay? You need a system, an efficient system. As I said, I went to Australia and we developed something called Consumer Measurement Systems in Child and Adolescent Mental Health. This was and you can even get that if you want for historical purposes. They still have it on the web in Australia. And so this was in 1997. I started to look at, well, what do we want to measure and what exists out there to measure these things? And we developed this monograph that described what we now see as the core of CFS of how it should deliver, but it was focused more on the measures at that point because that was a big decision. Do we have the measures necessary? And in 2004, for those of you who write grants, after several times being turned down, that's when you're allowed more than once, twice, we finally got funded to do a study I'll talk to you about in a minute. And then in 2010, we received another grant. We didn't receive, we fought for another grant that combines CFS with functional family therapy with Tom Sexton, with the objective being, if you want to optimize evidence-based treatments that have a some sort of manual or approach, the big thing Tom thought was missing in his was the feedback. That both in terms of processes that we weren't measuring. So in his system, we measure blame. We don't measure blame typically. But his system, there are phases people go through, clinicians go through in terms of moving about how well blame is being handled in the family. Now they have an objective measure to see if blame is being changed and when they should move into phase 2 or phase 3 based on some of the variables that they're getting feedback on, as opposed to this here. Just, oh, I think they're ready to move into a different phase. We also had support from SAMHSA, and actually we have a site in Florida that's bumping along with FFT, looking at how one of our versions worked with them. And I'll talk very briefly about a grant with then Kim Hogewood at Columbia University back then, from AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Quality, on a pilot study that we did. If I ever get finished, I know. CFS is theory and evidence-based. We learned this over time. We didn't start this way. I edit a journal and I keep hitting people who send us manuscripts that have no theory. And by theory, I don't mean big theory, a conceptual basis. Why are you expecting this to work? They should be able to explain that. I mean, I get these things and say, well, the data went in the expected direction. Well, expected by who and why? Just because you expected it, I should believe it? Tell me why it should work. And so we developed this from sort of ground up. Remember, we have a feedback approach, and we're dealing with the clinician. I'll just briefly describe it. Cognitive dissonance theory, we believe, operates here, that in order to get clinicians to change behavior, they have to experience some discomfort. If they're very satisfied with what they're doing, why change? So we attempt to try to have clinicians experience some discomfort, which we easily obtain in using our system, okay? Attribution theory. These are very traditional social psychological theories, lots of evidence. To what do they attribute this discomfort to is the issue. And that's the dangerous part, okay? This is all theoretical. So if you get feedback, how are you doing with your client? What's your first response?
Fine.
Wait, I'm asking her.
Sorry.
Huh? Huh?
Fine.
Fine? Passive? You just got to say fine? Come on, let's see something. What are you going to do? Feedback says patient's not improving, getting worse.
So you ask that?
Yeah, what are you going to?
Say that I'm working with the family or with the client and I'm doing this or that.
Yeah, and it says they're not getting better, they're getting worse. What are you going to? What's your first reaction? Don't be polite.
How do you know?
Hmm?
They're not complying with, my treatment's fine, it's maybe that the client's being not compliant.
Nah, you're even nastier than that. Come on.
What am I doing wrong?
What am I doing? Who said that? Oh, you poor thing. Blaming yourself. No, you're not going to blame yourself. Who are you going to blame? No, you're not going to blame the client. You're such a good clinician. You never blame the client. You're looking at them. You can blame me. What a stupid measurement system. This stuff ain't worth anything. I know what's going on. It's saying I can give you examples of how they're getting better. The data, this is what they do in Australia. That doesn't mean anything. So the first attribution we worry about is not having any sense that the data are valid. This is very risky business. Clinicians don't like numbers, remember? And they don't like objective measurements. We've done studies on this. You may be different because you're here, but by and large, they're not trained that way. They're not educated that way. They're educated to think here and not here, okay? So the first thing to do is to reject the data. That's an attribution. It's an easy one to do. It's not threatening to them. So they're self-protective, and I'll show you that. So we worry about that, okay? Two other theories that are relevant are self-efficacy and making it strength-based. And self-efficacy is, again, except for the minority of clinicians, and it really is a minority, I think, we want most people to walk away from experience here feeling better about their efficacy and not worse. That's the other thing. You can say, oh, it's my fault, I'm a terrible clinician, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, I'm very unhappy. And for some clinicians, that's great. Get the hell out, okay? Your boss will never know this. Maybe you will now, and you say, this is not a job for me, I'm getting this feedback. Our attribution that we really want, if something is not going right, is curiosity. What's going on here? Why are these numbers showing something different? They're valid, not perfect. Problem solving. Now, in our first version of the software, we were kind of stupid, I think. We had a column in there that if they got an alert that something was wrong, it was going to suggest what they should do. And in all honesty, what we realized was what? That I could ask questions no one has answers to. We didn't know. And I don't think anybody knows at this day, because we don't have the data to tell you if your therapeutic alliance is dropping, what should you do with this client? Now we have some actual manuals that go along with, that we've never tested, modules that look at things you can do, but empirically tested? No, you take therapeutic alliance, there's probably about 7,000 studies, and maybe there's 10 experiments. So most of it's correlational, most of it's non-intervention. We don't know what to do, we never developed research. Something as core as that, I never figured out why the field of clinical psychology. And I ask the experts, and I say, well, this therapeutic alliance business, is that something you learn or something that's born? Some clinicians are good with it, and I can never get people to answer that question either. Can you be trained? Oh, if you can't be trained in it, should we select clinicians for their ability? How would you select them? So we don't know a lot about what to do. So we were stuck with that column, okay? And the software company wasn't going to change it. So what do we do? Problem solved. We filled it in with the great advice that you can give. See your supervisor. Pass on the responsibility. Again, the feedback approach, thousands and thousands of studies outside of mental health showing feedback works, it's effective. You can't learn without feedback. Is therapy a feedback dependent profession? Huh? You think so? How do you learn? Yeah.
Seeing the responses of your clients and consultations with peers.
Okay. I want you to compare that to a carpenter and tell me which is more feedback responsive. I want you to compare that to a surgeon and tell me which is more feedback dependent. They're the same? I don't know about that. I'm not a clinician, remember, but you could sit there and say the most nonsensical thing to your clients and not know whether, I know from teaching, okay? And not know what they're thinking, not get any feedback, not be able to interpret that expression on your face, which is, yeah, you think so? I don't know. I find it a mystery to be able to elicit feedback. I'm a carpenter. Oh, this board should be 14 inches and I made it 13 inches. I know immediately. This thing is at an angle. It doesn't fit into the corner anymore. I know immediately. A surgeon, ooh, what's that sprouting out on the ceiling now? Oh, red. Oh, I must have made a mistake. Now, they make mistakes. They leave things in patients. They get feedback on that. It's not as immediate, but they do get feedback. Cut off the wrong arm, and those things happen 27 times a day in this country, those bedside surgeries. So, there are certain professions that you can learn from experience, and there are certain professions that are extremely difficult to learn from experience. Now, there's not a lot of research, and for those of you who are more experienced and less experienced, this may come as a shock to you, but in the crude measure, just measuring years of experience as a clinician and looking at outcomes, there's no correlation. You don't get better with experience. It's crude. So, but we pay people differently based on years of experience. Figure that out. The incentive is stay at this job long enough, you get paid more. But don't think that you're going to get paid more because you're better. And they don't relate. Therapy is not a feedback-dependent profession like a surgeon or a carpenter or a plumber. You think about, you do something, you get immediate feedback, did it work? You don't get that in clinical. You don't know what's working, what's not. You don't get any feedback, you don't collect any data, you have the faintest idea what happens after a client leaves. Nothing. I'm just talking about concurrent, you don't know. No one will say, I know, all my clients are doing great now. A year later, don't know. I'm not saying you should be responsible for them, but you don't know. So how can you learn how to do better if you don't know what they're doing? I'll talk about some data in a minute. I'm just going to go through this quickly. One of the things that we learned quickly, and that separates out CFS from a lot of the other evidence-based treatments, is we're very organizationally oriented. When you go in and put in a system like this, or any therapeutic system, you are changing the organization. And if you don't know that, you're going to make terrible mistakes. And if you do know that, you're going to make terrible mistakes. The mistakes will make happen anyway, because we don't know how to do this very well. So implementation sciences now is becoming a big thing in the field about how do we take something, put it in an organization, and obtain change. We're not sure how to do it. We collect lots of data. We do all kinds of preparation because we know we're changing the organization. We know that we want to go in and the workflow is going to change. We want to make it as painless as possible. We know that organizations who provide services collect lots of data and very little information. Differentiate between data and information, okay? Information is something that's useful. That they're required by various funders, state, Medicaid, to collect lots of information, lots of data, send it off somewhere, and they no feedback on it. I always recommend to keep sending the same report and see if anybody notices. No one, I don't know if anybody's taking me up on that. But basically, if you look at their resources, I've been in lots of meetings with state and other officials, and I look at their staff and I said, you can't possibly absorb the amount of data that you're collecting. Why are you asking people to create things for you that you can't look at, you can't get feedback on? So one of our basic principles is that we only try to collect information on things that's information, that's new to the clinician, or at least that we believe is new. Not things now maybe things that they think they already know, but we have shown, no, they don't know this. They think they know this. So that's a critical element. But we do organizational level surveys. We look at our own feedback mechanism built in about what's working and what's not working. That's one of the reasons why I keep it with different versions, is to get the feedback and change things hopefully for the better. And we connect to other evidence-based treatments, which is not easy because a lot of them are not specific and we don't know how to measure the constructs they're interested in. This was, I'm not going to go through it, and it's in Russian, so it doesn't help. But that was our original logic model of looking at how does change occur. There's a simplified version, just to point out. There are certain assumptions we make. If the clinician doesn't care about his or her job, this system will not work. We can't create that motivation. So if you have clinicians working who don't care about the outcomes of their clients, this is not going to matter. So it's committed to providing effective treatment and implementing CFS. If they don't want to implement it, they're not going to pay attention either. It's very hard to monitor that. They receive valid and reliable feedback about the current status. Again, this is the dissonance area. We want to make sure that they accept the information, they believe it's real, they pay attention to it, which is another problem to deal with. So we know that attending to things from people who are overworked anyway is difficult, so we try to make this as vivid as possible. Now, we think there's some cognitive dissonance, and typical dissonance is I thought I was doing much better than I was, the data showing. But it turns out often they're doing a lot better than they think, especially on alliance. Everybody, if you're getting low alliance scores, that is on a 4-point scale, if it's less than 3, you should fire that clinician because they're probably cutting the patient or something. I mean, that's what you have to do to get low alliance scores, I think. Taking personal responsibility for the data is part of the attribution process. We think this works because we give them solutions other than quitting or rejecting the data to direct their attribution process there.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Just to tie back to your slide from a few moments ago about the organizational values, does that really speak, are you really conceptualizing that more as the feasibility to then provide the context for this more individual level process to happen? This is about the clinician, but then
Yeah.
I'm thinking about
It's more than, it's definitely the feasibility of it, but it's the whole aspect. So for example, I was in this conversation with a bunch of state people, and they asked me, it was at an implementation conference, and they said, you are a purveyor. And I never thought of myself as a purveyor, but I said, actually I'm real proud to be called that because my father used to sell fruits and vegetables and he was a purveyor, so I'm following in a family tradition. I thought that was neat. Can you tell me your philosophy of purveying? And I said, to most of these state people who are public health people, I said, oh, it's anti-public health. Which they paid attention finally. Why? I said, well, public health interventions, in my interpretation, are designed for everyone. They're changing the pump handle, classic, on the town pump to reduce the typhoid. So it applies to everybody. I said, CFS doesn't apply to everybody. You can't go into a badly organized system and use CFS. Well, those are the ones that need it the most. I said, yeah, but you're not going to pay us to reorganize, to create better leadership, to create an organization that doesn't exist. So if you have a very bad organization, you don't want to use something like this because it'll make things worse in the short term. It will turn up problems that people have hidden for years. We found some of it can be overcome, but we found 2 units that never spoke to each other. And they had done that, who knows why. But now they had to interact, and it caused problems. So we are aware of those sensitivities. We are aware that, and I can give you loads of examples, but I'm not going to get through these things, of where they discover you have a clinician who's very ineffective. If you're a supervisor, this was not a problem before. You were happy. They handed their paperwork in on time. The fact that clients were getting worse under their care, you didn't know about. So ignorance was bliss. Now you have the data in front of you. Now you've got a problem. Your life is not as carefree as it was before. If you don't consider that part of your job and consider it a pain, then you don't want a system like this. If you're in an organization where your supervisor says, well, just deal with it, nothing we can do anything about, then you don't want a system like this. So whether or not this can be used in the majority of organizations out there, I don't know yet. I know we'll have greater implementation failures and we work hard to avoid them, but if it's disorganized, there's no leadership. Leadership has to be behind this. We've done studies looking at the leadership. And the verbal commitment is pretty meaningless. They have to show the behavior, and we've demonstrated over and over again. So we consider this a critical part, and it's one of the tensions we're having now about going to scale of how much can an organization afford in terms of spending time on preparation versus, hey, got to get started with this. Well, we know if you just got to get started with this, it's probably going to fail. And my guess is that's what we experienced over the last 2 decades with a lot of evidence-based treatment. You either compromise, which again, in my sense, the evidence-based treatment movement has been a detriment to the field, the way it's been implemented. You can't change clinician behavior by spending an afternoon in a workshop or a day like this. This is not going to change your behavior. Change your knowledge, change some of your attitudes. It won't change your behavior. You go back into the environment, you'll practice like you practiced before. I have no illusions about that. That's hard. It's hard work. And if the resources are not there, if people are overburdened, if there's no leadership, it won't happen. Does that answer more than you want to know?
Yeah, no, that's helpful, thank you.
I'm just going to list these problems because otherwise we're running out of time, and just briefly describe them. So, inadequate quality, improvement, and accountability. And basically, what I'm saying here is human services is not accountable. It doesn't have any way of being accountable, and there's no comprehensive to manage these things. And one last thing, the last slide there about commodity. Mental health services are a commodity like corn. Whenever you can't measure quality, you're dealing with a commodity. And what happens when you deal with corn? Who sells the most corn? Cheapest. Come on. So you're bidding, organization bidding for a thing. Oh, I can deliver treatment to these 1,000 clients for $2 a piece. And you lose the contract next year, say, I'll do it for $1.85. And we have experienced that over the last 2 decades. We're spending less money on mental health services each year because we can't measure quality of care. So a person who buys mental health services says, I buy by the hours and some minimum qualifications, which are quite irrelevant, like do you have an advanced degree, like it matters. Okay? We don't know if it matters. Second one, we provide, the solution to CS provides accountability, measurement, and feedback, and I will not go over those in any detail. How to increase resources in a decreasing environment is a problem, and we know that. And the example I like, how many of you have seen Moneyball, the baseball game? You should all go, you can get it for $1 now in red. Go see it, because it provides a lesson about how to use data. And the baseball team, the athletics, became #1 because they hired a recent graduate in economics from Yale to figure out who were the cheapest players I could buy, who were the best. And if you look at the film, there's some beautiful scenes in there where they have the scouts. These guys have been doing it for 30 years, just saying, well, this guy has a girlfriend who, and this guy was raised here, and the economist sitting there saying, it doesn't matter. How many runs have they earned is the only thing that predicts this. None of those other things that you think are there. And think whether you've had conversations like that in team meetings about what works with the client. It's really interesting. Data is power, from Popular Science magazine. Two organizations using data explicitly now are baseball teams and police departments. And they are, and I was speaking to somebody, a group last week, and it was like, if you are a commander of a police precinct in New York, you have weekly meetings with your commander, and they have police stats. And if your stats are showing going down, you're called up and say, tell me, why is crime increasing in your area? And what are you doing about it? Oh, that goes on in clinical supervision all the time. Why are your clients getting worse? Tell me what you're doing about it, right? And they're called up there, and they're accountable. And the next week, the next 2 weeks, if they're replaced if they can't show an improvement. Now, not always the total solution. They provide strategies for improvement as well. So CFS promotes efficiency through automation and relevant data. It should reduce paperwork, but in most cases, we're finding it very hard for people to give up paperwork that has no meaning. They hold on to it like a fetish for some reason. I don't know why. I ask, how is this information used? So anything you use CFS for, you have to answer the question, how will you use this information? Go through the data you collect now and ask that question, how is it being used? Well, the state wants it, or the funder wants it, but that's not good. What do they use it for? It can reduce paperwork, but that's up to the organization. In other words, we provide the opportunity to reduce a lot of paperwork, and in some cases, and Susan can talk to you about it, we have been successful of replacing whole bunches of paperwork with saying, here's it. You can follow the data to know whether the client's getting better or not. Lack of knowledge and difficulty in translating research into practice. Third problem, what works for whom. As I pointed out earlier, randomized clinical trials are great, but they're limited in scope. and we will never accumulate the amount of data that we need. And what we're experiencing outside of mental health, and are starting to have it in health, is the use of advanced analytics to deal with big data to understand what's trying to going on. And that's one of the directions that we're moving to as well. Transform providers into learning organizations. Chris and I just wrote a book 45 years ago called, I think it was Learning Organization. And as a graduate student, I was thrilled with reading the book about how organizations learn to do better. And I thought this was just great, until I got to the last page on the last sentence, where he said, of course, there are no such organizations. Well, I'm saying there are no organizations, but we never gave them the tools to be able to do it. CF is a tool that will allow you to do it if you have the motivation and leadership to be able to do it, to learn how to do better and contribute to that. So, 4, how to optimize treatment. We talk about individualization. You can't individualize it without individual data. You can't know whether your individual is doing better without individual data. We give data to clinicians, to supervisors, and if you want, you can give it to your client. That's up to your organization. It allows you to fit your services to the client, not the other way around, because you know what's happening and their response to it. And it's a continuous quality improvement tool. It enables you to learn how to do better. No tools, you're not able to communicate across agencies or within the same agency about the same client. If the client is in more than one program in your agency, you don't know what's going on. In the whole state of New York, we know that psychiatrists who have access to provide medication don't have access to what the mental health data looks like, and the people providing the mental health treatment doesn't have access to the automated medication data. Bizarre, as far as I'm concerned. And we shouldn't allow those things to go on. We've been working with them for years, and they agree that theory, they should be connected, but have yet to do it. I don't understand bureaucracies entirely, but that is a goal, to try to get all the data about your client on one page so everybody knows what is going on with that case. It can be used with any organizational structure in any agencies. You can use it with any language in terms of the questionnaires, but actually on next version, you'll be able to have the program written in different languages as well. So, but basically it's Spanish and English, and what else do we have?
Just those two.
Just 2 at this point. We have people doing Portuguese, translating our measures, at least to that. Use any schedule, which is very complicated. And that's Susan's bailiwick. I don't even understand what she did, quite honestly. But to be able to schedule things on the fly, because patients and clients change, they don't show up a lot, and which measure should they be getting this session? That's all automated. Here's a surprise to you, right? Clinicians don't know everything. And let me just spend a minute on this. More than 3/4 of child parent therapist triads had no consensus on a single problem after the first session. Who said that?
Kristen Holly and
Yes. Okay, so that's a published study, it's not one of ours. But just even agreeing on what the problem was. So when clinicians say, oh, I know what the problem is, they say, you know what the problem is, but the parent and the kid don't agree with you. And we find it over and over and over again. So when you talk about in-depth psychotherapy theory, I'm saying, you know, in teaching, where I've done some research, there's something called time on task that predicts better outcomes. Well, if you're discussing a problem with a client that they don't agree with they have, it's not going to get very far. And clinicians do that all the time. No correlation between standardized measures and clinicians' perception of problems. This, again, our studies and some other studies, if you look at collecting data, in fact, in our Fort Bragg study, it's the first time we did it, and we found out, hey, let me ask a simple question. A year later, if we asked the parent, how much does your child improve? We could save a lot of money in collecting data concurrently. If that worked, then we can ask the clinician the same question, and we'll be done. 2 questions. We don't need a big data system. Well, we found out that for the parent, the question, how much does your child improve, did not correlate with our measures taken. At that point, it was every 3 months or 6 months, I forget now. What did it correlate with? Remember my guess? Oh, now I'm getting the blank looks. Satisfaction. When we asked the clinician, what do you think it correlated for the clinician? Not with outcomes either, as we measured it standards. I see you're full of ideas this morning. I'm really challenging you. It correlated with their sense of compliance. So the compliant patient was seen as one who got better faster, but compliance did not correlate with our objective measures of it. So clinicians had difficulty detecting worsening of symptoms and functioning over the course of treatment. Several studies have shown this already. You ask them to predict, you ask them to even know, and they can't do it very well. So they're not getting, either they're not getting accurate feedback or they're not interpreting the feedback that they're getting from the client accurately. Level of care assignment goes back to the Fort Bragg study. Simple study. We thought maybe the reason Fort Bragg didn't work is clients weren't being assigned to the right level of care. Outpatient, hospitalization, this continuum. So we created descriptions based on our data of 50 patients and simply asked the clinicians 2 questions. And these are people who only did assignment to level of care at intake after they'd spent time with them. Where would you place this client? Group home, intensive outpatient, outpatient, hospital. We found no agreement. When I then put a group of them down and I said, all right, here I want you to read these things, and I want you to write down what your recommendation, and I want you to tell me, sort of speak aloud, why you think you would place them there. And we had one therapist said, well, this kid has been in the hospital for 10 days and apparently it's not working. We need to get him into a different treatment. Clinician says, this person has been in the hospital for 10 days and obviously they need more hospitalization. This is not working. Who's right? I don't know. That's the conundrum. That's the problem. They didn't have anything to help them. And so there was no consensus even. We couldn't even get past, are they making valid judgments? There was no reliable judgments on that. They poorly estimate how youth and caregivers rate therapeutic alliance. One of the things that, Susie, if I ever give a chance to how to talk, is we measure alliance in several different ways. And they're very brief instruments. In fact, there are only 1 question for the adults and 6 questions for the, we went from 72 questions to 1. We really try to concentrate on getting to the heart of the matter. We asked the question, it's all session-based. What was the alliance this session between you and the caregiver and you and the youth? And then we said, tell us how you think the youth and the caregiver rated the alliance, which is a more interesting question from our perspective. Those questions, those answers for the clinician correlated about 0.8. So they're saying how I rated the alliance is how the youth and the caregiver is going to rate it, right? And actually, the actual correlations were between 0.2 and 0.3. If you look at the correlations between the youth and the caregiver that the clinician provided, it's about 0.6. So they're thinking, if I'm doing good with the youth, I'm probably doing good with the caregiver. The actual correlations were 0.2. They're quite almost independent. So even things like concurrent ratings of alliance, they were not very accurate, but they thought they were. So they overestimate that. If you grade yourself, I was going to ask you how many of you rate yourself as an A clinician. It's late woebegone effect and glory. Everybody thinks they're at least an A or a B. Nobody thinks they're doing poorly. And in most cases, they're pretty good. Clinicians are actually pretty good on alliance especially. But not everybody is an A or a B. We get feedback that tells them where they are. And in addition, we have alerts that point out things because we don't want to just depend upon numbers that says this is really out of range. Focus on this. And supervisors have access to this as well. So if you look at the 6 problems that I laid out there very briefly, provides quality improvement, can increase provider efficiency, can increase knowledge of what works for whom and translate the research into practice that we hope happens, help do that. Designed to be integrated into other evidence-based treatments, and we're working now to integrate this into the other big thing operating, which is much bigger than clinical care, which is billing. So we're trying to form a connection between our system and billing systems, which is not always easy, but everybody's going to have electronic billing, electronic health records within the next year or 2. And the electronic health record people, by and large, don't do clinical care like this. So they are only focused on service indicators, and we need to be integrated with them. And crossing disciplinary and agency boundaries and program boundaries. We think we've accomplished all that. I'm going to just go briefly over the evaluations. December, we published this. This was 28 sites in 10 states. Never do a study like that again. Randomly assigned the sites at the site level to either feedback or no feedback. What we found, we used 356 youth, 1,500 sessions, using the largest national provider in-home services. That's been our client for the last 5 years. Briefly, the findings were, the more reports viewed by the clinician, the more often alert topics addressed. Susie will describe an instrument that we developed that tries to track what goes on during therapy sessions in a very crude but effective way. And what we find is if the clinician pays attention to the alerts, which we can have an indicator of, they change their behavior, which, remember, is the focus of what we're trying to do. It's self-reported behavior, but there's very little bias in it since they don't know what we're looking for. It's not like I'm doing good, okay? It improves clinical outcomes. In this study, we found the outcomes that we collected on a session-by-session basis from the youth, from the caregiver, and the clinician all showed greater improvement with the kids whose clinicians got feedback on their progress. And we find this nice thing, which helps when everything else fails, is a dose-response relationship, which is correlational. The better the implementation by the clinician, the faster the clinical improvement of their client. There's another study that we just finished, and we're still analyzing the data, and I call it a tale of 2 sites. We had 2 sites in this study, one an urban site, one a small town site. I'll let you figure out which one. Youth were randomly assigned within site, okay, not across. So now we're not doing sites, we're doing youth random assignment. 257 youth, 2,700 sessions, so it's a lot more in-depth than the previous study, but a smaller number of clinicians. And the random assignment was at the client level. So a clinician would get feedback on some of the clients and not the others. This argues, and we have data to support, that clinicians do not learn from one client to another. That's the assumption we had at the end. If I give feedback on client A, you're not going to learn how to be a better clinician with client B. And the analogy, although somewhat phony, is if you know my blood pressure, it's not going to help you treat that other person for blood pressure if I give you weekly readings. So we argued that in our current study, we had to move from clinician random assignment to client level random assignment because of that reason, because of numbers, basically. So each site is considered. We found the Red Hook, which was a small town site. CF improved clinical outcomes, but only for the clinician measure. We didn't find it for the youth or caregiver, so the results weren't as dramatic as we found. And it was only found it for one site. Implementation was simply better at Red Hook, and we now have a standard implementation measure, which essentially is the multiplication of the percentage of reports read, or at least accessed, multiplied by the percentage of questionnaires completed. So we have and that measure turns out to be very sensitive to picking up differences between sites and finding a dose response with this measure. The better the implementation, again, the better the outcome. Only found the Red Hook, and in this case we found it with the clinician and caregiver measures. Again, the clinician doesn't have any bias here, so we think it's a fairly good thing. I don't know why we didn't find it with the youth. Primarily, in lots of cases we walk into, kids seem to be pretty normal. I don't know about your data, but a lot of them turn out to be scoring very close to the normal range, whatever that is, and there's not a lot of room for improvement. And some kids will be in treatment because of a status, they're foster care or something, as opposed to they have a mental health problem. That's what we're thinking, basically. Version 3 is being tested in a large NIMH-supported randomized trial, combining CFS with functional family therapy, and there it's functional family therapy with and without CFS feedback. Everybody uses CFS to collect the data. Version 4, which is in development next week, actually, we hope, offer additional features such as business analytics. We're working with a different organization now who's very sophisticated in their informatics. And so we're taking advantage of a lot of things going on in healthcare that's not happening in mental health, such as online analytical processing, as well as ties to social media. We designed the system so it supports research. There's a random assignment procedure embedded in the system. If you want to randomize clients, caregivers, or sites to feedback and no feedback, that can be done. We use randomized block design and assign the cases. So, and it's extremely flexible, customizable in terms of the reports, the types of schedules, the type of instruments. You can use any instrument at this point that you pretty much want to, although we'll talk about hours. And there's one last point. So there's a lot we still don't know, and we need to focus on that in the next coming years. Oh, at least you smile, that's good. Okay, take a break now.
So I will try not to be too repetitive with Len, but my goal now is to really help shift into thinking about what it means to use feedback. Examples of how to do that, some of the barriers that you'll come across, and I'm going to talk about this, so I think it'll go back to your question, Mandy, in terms of constantly trying to think about how this applies to the individual session, the encounter, all the way up through the organizational level and back down. Because that's what we have found over the past several years is quite important. You've got to think of it at multiple levels. I was actually Len's student back in the 90s and worked with him on Fort Bragg and Stark County. Went away for several years and came back because he wanted someone, I'm a clinical psychologist, and he wanted someone to come help who was a researcher and a clinician to try to think about, how we get this out into the field. And so I've directed the training and implementation efforts for a long time. And when I came up with our first training manual, he was aghast. I mean, it was 70 pages long. Why in the world would it take so much? And we recognized over time, and it's one of the things I think is most exciting about what we've done, is we understand this is a relationship that's going to be ongoing forever. The sustainability behind an idea like feedback is not that eventually you don't need it anymore. That's the point. So I'll be talking about, a little bit about why feedback. And then just to orient you to the system, how does CFS work? It is a secure system, it's dashboard driven, and we use this evidence-based clinical feedback. And then I'll walk you through a series of slides where we talk about what CFS can do for stakeholders at different levels of the system, along with the examples for that. One way that helps you is it starts to give you the language that you can think of using with your clients and their caregivers, with your directors in a supervision session, because this is basically taking a new technology and trying to add it to your everyday workflow. That can be tough to do. It takes a long time to change habits, as we know. So what type of feedback do you receive in your everyday life or in your professional life? Just a couple people.
Verbal feedback.
Verbal feedback. Somebody might say, good job. And what do we say? If you, good job. Are you going to know what I'm talking about?
It's unlabeled praise.
It's unlabeled praise. Yeah, it's not very specific, is it? So a lot of the times the feedback that we get is vague. It's not specific. My take on things, you'll hear as we go along, is a little bit different than Len's. It's a little bit more expansive. Generally, the way I think of the clinician is how treatment happens. It's not going to happen unless it comes through that person. They are the mechanism of treatment. They are vital and most important. And what happens in that relationship space between the clinician and the client is where treatment happens. But we know, I'm not going to go into depth on these slides. Len already went over these points. The feedback that you get when you're sitting with somebody can be pretty vague. It's not that you are inaccurate necessarily. It's that you are working with vague, unspecified information. So when it's compared to systematic measures, like standardized measures, there typically isn't much of a correlation. For this slide, this is just a visual representation of one of the things that Len talked about, where those black pieces of pie you can see are where the client and the therapist, or the parent and the therapist, agreed on 0 presenting problems. So this is indeed a big issue. All of our research, if you think about it, we have the research going on, and then we have the administrative and the legal and requirement side of things. So what do people focus on? Len alluded to this. We look at the type of degree, we look at the years of experience, we look at CEU hours. You guys are indeed earning some today. Those are the best we have at trying to ensure that those clinicians, those mechanisms of treatment, are benefiting from the best of what we know. It's not a very effective model because, again, you're not a carpenter. You can't hit yourself with the hammer, get immediate feedback. That didn't work because it kind of hurts your thumb. Instead, you have to try some things out. You may not even see that client for another 2 weeks, and then their report back might be a little bit unspecific, and so on and so forth. So we think, I love this quote, we think that feedback is absolutely essential, particularly for mental health treatment, and even in healthcare too, and in education. The way I think of it is anytime you have an intervention that has to be delivered within a relationship between two people, you need some sort of feedback system because it adds that systematic component that is part of the art, and it brings the science into the art of treatment. So Jim Clemmer wrote this article, Don't Wait to See the Blood, and he wrote, improving personal and organizational performance without constant feedback is like trying to pin the tail on the donkey when we're blindfolded. Only through knowing where we are can we change where we're going. And I have a 9-year-old, and I watched him a few years ago like pin the tail on the donkey. And they just weren't very good until you started shoving these little children around and tapping them and making noises so they had some sort of indicator which way to go. It's the same thing. It's pretty simple. So what is an MFS? Remember, an MFS, that's a new piece of language I want you to be able to leave here with today, is a measurement feedback system. It's really just, it's a way of trying to put all of this together. CFS is an example of an MFS. Most importantly, and why it is now that this is something that's really coming into the field and has the potential to revolutionize the way we do our work, is because we have the technology. We have it, it's cheap, you can do this on a smartphone. There's no reason why we can't have this as part of our work now. Even 5 years ago, it was difficult to do and it was too expensive. So really, it's digital. An MFS, all that means is it's a system, it's administered frequently, as often as every time you have an encounter with the client. It's concurrent with treatment, provides rapid, useful, and objective feedback, And this is important. It includes information, includes feedback, not just on outcomes, but on the process. So one of the things I'm going to try to do as we go through today is point out a few myths that I come across time and time again when I'm doing initial training with folks. One of the things I do is ongoing coaching and consultation over time. And one of the things that I have found, most indicative of this type of work is that these are issues that are constantly coming up, and we kind of have to listen for them. So the first is, how many of you, and somebody over on this side of the room said something earlier, how many of you have used routine outcome measures as part of your work? Like what? You raised your hand.
Care report, questionnaires.
Mm-hmm. So questionnaires.
Questions too.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any that are required by your funders?
Yes.
Like what?
We have no maltreatment during treatment, no verified, none 30 days after, none 60 days after, none a year after, plus our follow-up phone interviews.
Okay, so you have, I'm hearing a couple different things that's very typical of the way you work. One is that you have specific timelines for gathering information, documenting it in a particular way, and reporting that to someone. And then the types of information too. You might be required to use a particular assessment tool as part of a particular treatment modality, or even just because your funders require it. So does that sound pretty familiar? What I want you to do is I want you to try to keep that in mind, and then as we go through these slides, I want you to feed that back to me, because already you are at risk of having the wrong conceptions about what we're talking about today. So just know that. Feedback is not that.
I have one particular referral source as an unusual requirement, and that is that I get written feedback from my patients' patients.
Your patients' patients?
Yes.
How does that work?
These are physicians who have misbehaved, and I'm required to get feedback that is anonymous from their patients saying my doctor's behaving nicely.
That's very interesting and helpful, and indeed a good quality indicator, because you're actually trying to get information from the people who are going to be a pretty good judge of that behavior. So
either they turn out to be a poor judge, or me and my patients are just doing incredibly well.
And that's similar to what Len was talking about earlier about the therapeutic alliance. It's typically really good. Sometimes it's not, but not often. So you want to think about who you're going to get the feedback from. But as you are thinking about this, one of the general tenets of any kind of development of an information system is that you have to understand that information has a different meaning to different people who are going to use it in different ways. So if you are collecting information because you're required to on a certain timeline for certain funders, automatically you are doing something that you think you're doing for somebody else. How many of us as supervisors, you said you focused a lot on compliance, that the administrative piece of supervision is vital and necessary. That's part of your performance evaluation. You have to get this stuff done to be able to bill and get paid. Did we talk about, so documentation in any of that sentence, was there anything about it being clinically useful? There wasn't. So how often do you do documentation? Do you write something down because you have to? You have to put it in the medical record. Do you write it up and then think, wow, that was amazing. I just came to this new realization about what's happening. You don't often, do you? That's, again, one of the problems. We've tried to approach how to improve, how to institute quality improvement in clinical care from a very removed administrative perspective. An MFS can give you a completely different way of thinking about documentation, where it becomes vital to what you do. You can use it to deliver a sentence in the next treatment session. You can use it to develop a guiding question or a challenging prompt to come in and talk to your client. So, set aside what you know and what you're thinking about. We have a bunch of surveys. People are going to bubble in questions. Automatically, you're going to start thinking this is like, oh, that routine outcome assessment, and we do this every 30, 60, 90 days. CFS, a measurement feedback system, should be part of your ongoing assessment. And what is ongoing assessment? You all do it. You've been doing it with us today. You've been sitting there going, is this going to be interesting or not? You were doing that before we started. You're probably still doing that a little bit now. Am I going to learn something new? And then you might learn something new, and then you get even more engaged, and you're paying more attention. That's part of your ongoing assessment just of us today. We all do this. It's part of being a good clinician. It requires continuous review, looking at your documentation, completing that treatment plan. That's the why behind it. Whether it gets used that way in practice or not is a different story. And you're continually building on information from the moment that you get a referral to the moment that you discharge that client. This isn't rocket science. You all know this stuff. What kinds of information do you use for ongoing assessment? Well, you use your experiences and your observations, tone, body language. Len I wasn't turning around every time he said it, but I kept hearing him. Bright faces. Oh, nobody's smiling now. Somebody is talking. No, nobody. So he was giving you some feedback on your engagement as you were going along. Your conversations with others. This is part of what we document. It's important. It shows that, we are getting multiple perspectives. Sir, as you said, being able to get multiple perspectives on the same behavior is very important, because we typically know that there's no one right story. That's not the point of therapy. Instead, it's to understand multiple perspectives to have the best picture. You simply add another piece to ongoing assessment, and that's going to be the questionnaires that you deliver at each session, and then the feedback that you look at in between sessions. How do you filter all that information? There's a lot of complexity in mental health care. There's a lot of complexity in a healthcare encounter too. One of my projects is working with military healthcare providers who do screenings of returning service members. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to work on their relationship that they establish in 5 minutes, the 5-minute interviews with these returning service members, and try to create a relationship space where the service member might be more likely to tell them if he or she has a problem. And what we have found is that we can impact that 5-minute encounter. You guys have what, 30, 50-minute hours? So you have a lot more time. Clearly, the treatment, the protocol happens through you. You don't give people shots. You don't measure their blood pressure. Instead, the treatment occurs through you. So it's your background. It's the way you think. It is your training. It is what you find interesting. It is the supervision that you get. And we want to add another piece. It's the feedback that you can get from these systematic questionnaires that are completed, the same battery over time. So it gives you constant systematic information to add to these other pieces. Because personally, I don't think that a lot of psychotherapy can happen without the complexity that you bring as the person that happens in that space in between you and the client. I don't think there's a lot of psychotherapy that can happen just, for example, by sitting in front of a computer that follows a script. You have to be very flexible. You have to be able to adapt. You have to understand how to take evidence-based principles and apply them in that particular moment in time. I think it's hard to do.